Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to the first meeting of the Nature of Justice Workshop Series. My name is Andrew Carl, and I'm a professor of history and African American studies and the co-director of the Repair Lab, an interdisciplinary research collaborative focused on exploring the causes, consequences, and countermeasures of racial and environmental injustice. As the newest research lab within the University of Virginia's Democracy Initiative, the Repair Lab is eager to build our community and advance the work of those of you who are doing research at the intersection of race and the environment, both here at UVA and beyond. We look forward to sharing details on future meetings, events, and funding opportunities with you, and encourage you to check out our website, repairlab.as.virginia.edu. and sign up to be on our email list. We posted a link where you can sign up in the chat. Before we begin, I want to make a few announcements about some upcoming lab events. On October 14th at 3:30 p.m., Professor of Environmental Sciences and Repair Lab co-director Sally Pasueti will be presenting her research on nitrogen dioxide air pollution inequality in US cities as part of the Environmental Science Department seminar series. The talk will be virtual, and we included a link to this event in the chat. And on Wednesday, October 27th at 12 p.m., we will be holding our next Nature of Justice workshop. Dr. Julie Z., Professor of American Studies at UC Davis and the author of the book, Environmental Justice in a Moment of Danger. We hope you can join us in. Lastly, I want to mention that during the second half of today's event, Professor Torres will answer questions from the audience. We will collect questions throughout the event using the Zoom Q&A chat box. We encourage you to submit questions at any point during the event. You don't need to wait for the Q&A to begin to submit them, and we will try to get to all of them during the Q&A. And with that, let me hand it over to my colleague and fellow co-director of the Repair Lab, Professor Kimberly Fields, who will introduce our guest.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Andrew. And welcome again, everyone. Thanks so much for joining the Repair Lab's live webinar series today. And I'm super excited about our guest today. It's truly an honor for me to introduce Professor Gerald Torres. Professor Torres wears many hats and serves in many roles. He is an acclaimed global scholar of environmental law, critical race theory, and federal Indian law, an environmental activist and professor of environmental justice at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. As a pioneer in the field of environmental law and environmental justice studies, Professor Torres has spent his career examining the intrinsic connections between race, law, the environment, and social justice. Professor Torres is an example of an activist scholar who produces scholarship that takes seriously, centers, and meaningfully integrates the knowledge and experiences of the people living in frontline and marginalized communities. His groundbreaking and award-winning book, The Miner's Canary, Enlisting Race, Resisting Power, and Transforming Democracy, which he co-authored with Professor Lonnie Guinier, was a truly excellent book. In fact, Publishers Weekly called it the most
Sorry about that.
found especially useful. Through his scholarly work and by example, Professor Torres has created space, both literal and intellectual, and a blueprint for emerging scholars like myself, who seek to produce intellectually rigorous, materially grounded, and community-informed cutting-edge scholarship that supports the efforts of the brave and committed grassroots activists. Are you able to hear me now? I got a message.
Gotcha.
We're all
Okay.
good.
All right. I'll start here. Through his scholarly work and by example, Professor Torres has created space, both literal and intellectual, and a blueprint for emerging scholars like myself who seek to produce intellectually rigorous, materially grounded, and community-informed cutting-edge scholarship that supports the efforts of the brave and committed grassroots activists who at great personal cost have been for many years sounding the alarm about the effects of pollution on all life on Earth and pointing us toward a better way. We are truly fortunate to have Professor Torres here with us today. So thank you, Professor Torres, for your work, your example, and commitment to EJ, and welcome. I'm so happy to have you here, and I'm very much looking forward to learning from what you have to share with us today.
Thank you for having me. I hope, is the sound okay? I hope it's okay. I suppose I could have done better with the lighting, but oh well. As you can probably tell, I haven't really even moved into my office here. It's the shelves are barren of most things except I think printer ink. But before I begin, I want to thank the University of Virginia. I want to thank Andrew Carl and Kimberly Field for their work in putting together the Racial Justice Environmental Policy Lab. And I'm honored to speak with you today. I also want to thank Sarah Ross and Christine Linson-Bigler, who are operating behind the scenes to make sure this works. I'm going to use some slides today. I should warn you in advance, since I'm basically Paleolithic, I don't use slides very often. I hope that they work. The idea of environmental justice and its emergence as a field of study is important. But before I begin, I'm going to take this time to shamelessly promote two events which you might be interested in. One is you can subscribe to the weekly newsletter from the Yale Center on Environmental Justice by going to our web page, YCEJ. And at that website, you'll see a link to a conference that we're putting on at the end of October. It's the Chichelnitsky Global Environmental Justice Conference. That's the main theme. This theme of the conference changes yearly, but I encourage you to join us. You can join us, obviously, remotely, and I encourage you to come. So the thing I want to talk about today is how activism has changed the scholarly frame for environmental justice. In many ways, how it created both a field of advocacy, but then drove academic work and scholarly work to try to fill out the issues it raised or investigate the issues it raised. And then it had an effect on policy from the national to the local level, but also internationally. And so the idea of watching and participating to a certain extent in the events that have come to be known as environmental justice has actually produced wide-ranging and profound effects. So I'm going to try to organize the talk today in three basic parts. So first, I'm going to talk about the activism and what drove the creation of environmental justice first as a subset, and then as a central part of environmental law and policy. Second, I'll turn to the stage at which environmental justice was institutionalized to a certain extent. And there I'll talk about the impact on of the movement on governmental policies. I will talk to the impact of the movement on the way businesses conduct themselves. And I'll talk, of course, on the impact of environmental justice and the movement on the academy. And so that's going to be the overall structure. I do want to note, and I'll come back to this point. You'll see when I get to the slide in which I discuss the ways in which justice has been used in the movement or in the conversation about the movement. I've left off the category of restorative justice, and I did that on purpose. And we'll talk about why, but we'll save that for the end. So let me talk a little bit about the movement. So you can go to the next slide. So the four things I'm going to talk about in discussing environmental justice, and you'll note that I've now included climate justice in this, and even though it's not part of the official title, my sense is that the climate justice initiatives are part of, are in some ways informed by the way in which environmental justice addressed issues of environmental management, environmental protection, and even the definition of the things that include things to include in the ambit of the inquiry when you put the word environment at the front of it. If you're going to talk about the environment, justice, whether it's climate change or whether it's pollution control or whether it's outdoor recreation, you have to include ideas of justice, or it causes you to at least confront ideas of justice. So I'll talk a little bit about where environmental justice comes from, how the idea came to include climate change, some of the differences between climate justice and environmental justice. And then I'll try to answer the last question, which is, why does law and policy often lag behind the popular expression of these ideas? So first, where did the idea of environmental justice come from? It has been afoot, at least in my own experience, since at least 1968, as an issue confronting mainstream environmentalism. My colleague, Dr. Dorceta Taylor, traces it back to the 19th century, although the modern iteration of environmental justice really evolved from a couple of sources. One was civil rights activists who looked at the big green organizations and asked where the representation of disadvantaged communities could be found in their management and leadership structure. So some of it focused on changing the direction, the leadership of big green organizations. It also came from, I think, what is now called the Blue-Green Alliance, but what used to be called, and I don't think this organization exists anymore, the Environmentalists for Full Employment. It was a union-driven environmental movement, but it asked environmental regulators to take into account the impact of environmental regulation on working people. So those two groups came together in 1978 with the National Urban League in a meeting, the Sierra Club, National Urban League, and the Environmentalists for Full Employment coming together in 1978 for a meeting in Detroit, in which they raised some of these issues and started to grapple with the need for the environmentalists to be more capacious in their understanding of what was at stake as they regulated pollution control primarily is what they were focused on, although conservation is a big part of that as well. So that was from my own experience, that was the first, my first exposure to it as a specific set of issues. And then everyone is undoubtedly familiar with the United Church of Christ study that identified the burden that Black communities were facing from the placement of hazardous waste sites. And it came to the conclusion that 4 out of 5 hazardous waste sites were located in African American communities. And then with further research, it disaggregated all of the variables and concluded that the variable with the most predictive power of where hazardous waste sites would be located turned out to be race. So what that told us, well, it told us a lot of things, obviously, but one of the things it told us is people needed to pay attention to the decision-making process that ended up yielding decisions that would always seem to disproportionately burden African American and Black communities. So that was a major event in the modern environmental justice movement. The thing that happened after that was a widespread local resistance, largely initially framed around controlling the placement of facilities or cleaning up facilities that were located in poor African American or otherwise marginalized communities. The importance about the grassroots nature of the movement is that it indicated a couple of things. One, that the idea of unfair burdens being spread as the effort to, in fact, do what is a good thing, control pollution or reduce contamination, that the good effect of environmental regulation had to take into account past decisions and incorporate in their decision-making process the impact of the decisions they would make on African American communities in particular, but poor, disadvantaged, and marginalized communities as a whole. One of the interesting things that the environmental justice movement did, and it in some ways it was really formative. What they did is they tried to demonstrate how the current effects of environmental burdens could be traced in many instances to past instances of racial animus, racial discrimination. And so one of the ways in which the environmental justice movement was characterized was as environmental racism. Now, environmental racism, in some ways, has always been at the center of the environmental justice movement, but it aims at a particular kind of injustice and suggests that that particular kind of injustice, racial injustice, ought to be the trigger for more searching inquiry into the decision-making process, so that you have environmental justice, you have environmental racism generating local activism, which caused issues to bubble up, largely by the resistance from these communities, but it also was doing something else. And it's doing something else that will, I'll talk about a little bit later, but is really actually critical. What it started to do was to give new boundaries to the kinds of issues that ought to be considered in the environmental policymaking sphere. So one of the things that the environmental justice movement did, right, was to drive policy. And what it did importantly was not just to drive policy to get people to come to preconceived conclusions, but to suggest that there were avenues of exploration that needed to be undertaken, needed to be gone down, that in fact the justice and racial implications of environmental policy, and here I'm including the broad range, you know, from pollution control to conservation, all of those had to be addressed. Now, let me just drop one footnote here. One of the things that has always been apparent and has been discussed is in the conservation field anyway, is the displacement of Native people from their lands, even as that displacement was done in the service of the protection of wild spaces or the identification of wild spaces. So the footnote is, you know, people need to remember that wilderness is a creation, as an American creation, but it was also literally a creation, because what it required in the national park system as it was initially developed, what it required was the removal of the people who were there first in order to produce something that approximated the vision of wilderness. But that's another side of environmental justice. But it's one of the ways that the idea of justice is actually the idea of environmental justice is actually old. So you had all of this ferment at the local level, and you then had networks and national groups, environmental justice groups, take up the issue. And with the election of Bill Clinton, what you got was a commitment to the assembled environmental justice groups, a commitment that the administration would take this idea seriously, and that it would try to act on those concerns. So they early on in the first Clinton administration, the president adopted Executive Order 12898. You can go to the next slide, or the next two, I suppose. But this in some ways, Executive Order 12898, the Executive Order on Environmental Justice, was the first expression at a national level of the need to take environmental justice concerns seriously and to try to integrate them into policymaking judgments. So the idea of the executive order is really pretty simple, and everyone needs to understand, right, that the executive order really was an instruction to the executive branch, right? The agencies in the executive branch. And that's where the president has the capacity to exercise the most control, right? And so it was an instruction to all of the federal agencies to integrate in their decision-making a way for them to be able to discern the disproportionate impact of their decisions on what came to be called in the executive order environmental justice communities. Now, it wasn't just addressed to the EPA or to the so-called environmental agencies. It recognized that every federal agency is in a position to make decisions that have an impact on the environment. And in this ways, it mirrored the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, in recognizing that every agency that creates activities in the natural world, the physical world, that either approves or initiates actions that take place in the physical world necessarily have potential environmental consequences. And one of the things the executive order did is to say to those agencies, these environmental consequences have to include the disproportionate impact on environmental justice communities. As the presidential memorandum said, right, the order is designed to focus federal attention on environmental and human health conditions in minority communities and low-income communities with a goal of achieving environmental justice. So that's what the executive order was aimed to do. But the executive order was, having participated in the drafting of it, I'm pretty happy with what it did, but it didn't do everything. So let's go to the next slide. I hope I clarified enough what an executive order is. You can come back and ask questions about that. If you have questions about that, I'd be happy to answer it. So what did it miss? The basic charge of the executive order, you can go to the next slide. Basic charge of the executive order was this: that the federal agencies must identify and address as appropriate disproportionately high and adverse environmental and human health effects of its programs on minority populations and low-income populations. Okay, that's great. Right, that's the basic charge. The agencies now have to take this into account as they acted. The problem, of course, is there's a lot of questions in that formulation. Right? One is what are disproportionately high and adverse environmental and human health effects? You need a baseline. And so one of the issues is, what's the baseline that you have to draw to determine whether or not there are disproportionately high adverse effects? The second question is, how do you define the communities? So let's go to the next slide. The other thing it did is it instructed agencies to act to the greatest extent practicable and permitted by law. Well, that, of course, you'll find that formulation in a lot of environmental statutes. But one of the questions is that it also raises the baseline question. Right? What is practicable, given the charge that each agency has from Congress? Can they take these kinds of considerations into account as they act? Next slide. We can go to the next slide. Well, maybe go back one. I'm sorry, or maybe that I have them out of order, so it's my problem. Anyway, the basic definition of Executive Order 12898 was to require a fair treatment and meaningful involvement in policy. Right? So that's the charge. That meant that to the extent that federal law permitted it, the agencies had to work out a definition of what fair treatment would be and they had to look at the processes they used to assemble public opinion in order to create opportunities for the potentially affected communities to participate. Okay, so that's what 12898 was trying to do. The way it was going to do that was to require every agency to produce a plan. I would have to say not every agency ended up producing a plan for how they would achieve those goals of the executive order. But the instruction from the president's office is there. Okay. So what happened? That's the way it got institutionalized at the national level initially. Right. I'm really anxious to read Dr. Field's book on the integration of environmental justice at the state level, because there's been a lot of activity at the state level as well. I'm not going to comment on that except to say we see the impress of the environmental justice movement in the state-based climate concerns. So that and the climate proposals, particularly in New York, where the effort to address carbon loading actually incorporated the concerns of the environmental justice community, perhaps not all the way, but significantly. We also see it in the cap and trade program in California. And here you could look at Michael Mendez's book, Climate Change from the Streets, in which he details how popular activism of the environmental justice communities actually led the state government to change the way in which they were administering the cap and trade program, and to create a fund from the cap and trade program for projects in environmental justice communities. So you saw not just the executive order, but what you also saw was states and localities reacting to the now legitimized critique that environmental justice activists were making. So you went from activism, which raised the issue, which detailed the ways in which environmental justice hadn't been achieved, and environmental burdens were unequally distributed. But it also went further. It said, not only are the environmental burdens unequally distributed, our capacity to participate in the way in which decisions get made has been inhibited. And in order to achieve something that we can agree is a good goal, let's say reduction of pollution, in a way that doesn't spread those burdens unevenly, we have to be at the table and we have to participate. So it raised the question of participation right at the beginning. And you see that at the local level, you see it at the state level, and you see it at the national level. You certainly see it in the current administration. Okay, so that's how it affected, how this activism affected, was institutionalized in the governmental sphere. In the academy, it was also institutionalized in that it became a line of inquiry that gained legitimacy. It permitted, certainly in law schools, it permitted us to ask the question of whether the environmental statutes as they were being enforced actually created a better environment for all. It's indisputable that the overall environment has been improved since 1970 and the passage of what we think of as the landmark and major environmental statutes. Indisputable. But the difference that the environmental justice activists pointed out was that when you choose the baseline to try to discern whether there's been improvement, right, you need to be relatively specific, and you need to take into account the ways in which other burdens which exacerbate the environmental burdens have been ill-distributed. Here, and I think Dr. Carl works in this area, right? Here, redlining is one example. Redlining, which meant that the main access to accumulate wealth, which is in American life, had previously been home ownership, was unfairly distributed. That meant you created communities that were situated by virtue of housing policy in less in disfavored areas. Let me just put it that way. Okay. There was a recent article in the New York Times, I think about a month ago, that demonstrated that if you just take pictures of neighborhoods and assess the tree canopy cover or assess the amount of green space, you can predict just from that data alone what the composition of those neighborhoods is going to be. Now, you may not think of that as an environmental justice concern, but one of the things the environmental justice activists did was to say the things that are captured by the landmark environmental statutes don't capture all of the ways in which the environmental burden of our modern industrial life are ill-distributed. So let's take the tree canopy issue as just one example. What public health researchers have discovered is that the ill distribution of tree canopy does a couple things besides improving the value of the property to which it's associated. One, right? So it raises the capacity of those communities to produce and capture wealth. One. Two, it also reduces, as we're seeing, and this is the tie back into climate, it also reduces the heat island effect that urban life produces. And if you read a subsequent article in the Times, you recognize that in the latest hurricane, the more deaths are attributable to heat than to the actual hurricane itself. So the knocking out of power, but the higher heat in these communities mean that they're less healthy. Third, the air quality is better in communities that have more trees. And it's better largely because the canopy actually captures particulate matter. And particulate matter, which has been a precursor to asthma and other respiratory ailments. The air in neighborhoods with better tree canopy and green cover are going to be healthier. Okay. The last thing, which is I found particularly interesting, was that they've discovered that actually access to green spaces and living in greener spaces is actually have mental health impacts as well. So that the idea of what an environmental issue is was broadened by the environmental justice movement. That gave researchers in the academy more areas to consider. So the range of subjects that ought to be investigated in the process of trying to figure out how environmental policies work and what falls into the category of environmental policy actually was improved by listening to the communities, by listening to the things that increase the morbidity and mortality in those communities, tracing back the links from the morbidity mortality tables to the actual environmental the concrete environmental effects of either long-range pollution, short-range pollution, the structure of the communities themselves, and obviously you see it in terms of energy usage. You see it in terms of water quality. Flint, of course, being the poster child for that, but there are towns in New Jersey as well, and New York State. So that the environmental justice community said, look, if you're going to think about justice and you're going to think about the environment, you have to have a broader range. You cannot just focus on the main environmental or the landmark environmental statutes. You've got to ask, how do we need to get the agencies to act even before they adopt new statutes, for example? How can they, within the exercise of their policy discretion, start to address the issues that we've identified? One thing it has done, right, is it's gotten some of the regulators to focus on supplementary environmental projects, SEPs, which are available as part of the remedial package. They were abandoned recently, but they can be revived, which permits actual concrete changes as opposed to just payment of fines or bringing the offender into compliance. Okay, so all that was driven by activism. It was institutionalized in the academy, it was institutionalized in the government, and then we get the Biden administration. So this was taken from the introduction to Plan EJ 2014, right? But go to the next slide, I think. The Biden administration, right, wants to make environmental justice more intelligible to people. And I have to say, it's proof that the environmental justice movement, which started at the grassroots, has been institutionalized when you hear the President of the United States committing his administration to achieving environmental justice. So we can go to the next slide. And this is the proposed revision of the WEJAC to the executive order. So the term environmental justice means the just treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, or ability, with respect to the development, implementation, enforcement, and evaluation of laws, regulations, programs, policies, practices, and activities that affect human health and the environment. So one of the things that's clear from this restatement is that institutions can learn, right? So one of the things that the activists did was to try to grapple with the executive order in its initial incarnation, point out the limitations, and get the new administration to focus on a broader definition of environmental justice that incorporates every step of the regulatory process, as well as building in the capacity to participate in the development of those policies. The Biden administration is endeavoring not just to take seriously environmental justice in this way, but to deliver in terms of the benefits that go to environmental justice communities. So the Justice 40, for example, program or initiative, I guess at this point, right, calls for 40% of the benefits of improving the environment to be located and identifying in low-income and otherwise marginalized communities. Okay, so let's go a couple of slides. Get to the slide that says, the one that says defining justice. Okay, so both in terms of institutionalization at the government level, but also in the academy, the question of defining justice obviously is key. I mean, you of course, excuse me, have to ask what justice is. In some ways, you can put it in the context of the particular regulatory structure you're looking at. Or you can say, we have to understand what justice means, and then use that as a way to interrogate the ways in which the existing regulatory structure has failed to take it into account. Now, there are three main areas when we define justice. So you can go to the next slide. And the main effort is to move beyond the basic idea of distributive justice. So remember the initial construction of it in Executive Order 12898, and even its reconstruction in the proposed amendments to Executive Order 12898, focus on the unfair distribution. Now, the proposed revisions, of course, are significant because they want to build into every stage of the policymaking process a consideration with the idea of justice. So distributive justice is, in terms of unfair distribution, the baseline has to be, choose a baseline community, and then you assess a particular community against that baseline. And what you want to do, obviously, is to reduce the pollution load, reduce the burden to the lowest amount permissible under the existing statutes. But let's look at these other three definitions of justice, or additions to our understanding of the way in which justice will be interrogated in the context of federal environmental law. So the first is compensatory justice. And that is the question asked, right? What is the obligation to directly address the harms that communities have suffered? Who pays and for what? Well, here I want to bring us back to climate for a minute, because you'll note that the way in which our legal system is structured largely takes consideration of group impacts out of the equation, so that if individuals are harmed, they can seek compensation from the persons who harmed them. Where there has been a systematic set of decisions that have resulted in communities being more likely to be harmed. So the example I gave earlier was redlining, right? You could say, look, that was a set of governmental decisions that ultimately created a greater vulnerability for these communities today. Now, the fact that the communities have been burdened and harmed by particular activities may be true, right? But it's also been exacerbated by these prior decisions. How do you account for that? Who pays for all of the damage? And do you pay for just the material deprivation, or what do you pay for? You can think about things like diminished capacity to participate economically, right? So how do you calculate that? These are questions people are grappling with, but an important question really pivots around the idea of communities. So one of the questions, it was actually answered recently in a case in Texas, where an African-American community was going to be displaced by the construction of a new bridge. And the community there said, look, you can buy our individual homes. And that's one way, the government can always say that they condemn your home and pay you the fair market value. And so long as it's going to be put to public use, you may complain, but they have the capacity, the power, and the right to do that. But what this group said is, this is actually an historic free Black community in Texas. It has historic roots to this area. It has historic roots, historic links to one another. And if we're moved, we want to be moved as a community. Ultimately, the settlement that was entered into permitted the community to be relocated as a community. Similarly, in the Kivalina case in Alaska, you have Native communities that are being forced because of climate change to be relocated. You could say, well, each individual member of that community has the right to be relocated, but their argument is the cultural integrity of our community demands that we be relocated as a community. That raises obviously some questions for how to think about compensatory justice, and to what extent there are intangible things like the cultural integrity of community that will be lost or will be damaged if you fail to consider the community as a community. Okay, that's compensatory. Procedural justice. The argument that the activists raised, and which government and academics are now considering, right, is what accounts for process failure. If we can try to figure out why processes break down, then we can start to retrofit them or recreate them in order to ensure that the maximum legitimate participation is ensured. Okay. If there have been voices that have been systematically excluded, we have to ask, what are the instruments of that exclusion? Are they built into the process, which we thought was a fair procedural process, but turns out on closer examination to have effectively excluded these voices? It's led to a new, basically new research into procedural design, and that's important. Finally, there's recognitional justice. That means that the policies and the agencies that are acting have to acknowledge the groups for who they are. Kyle White, as I note there, says that fairly representing and considering the cultures, values, and situations of all affected parties is what recognitional justice means. But it raises issues that are going to differ, certainly across Native populations and the relationship between Native populations and states and Native populations and the national government. Now, normally in this list, you'll find when you do look at some of the research, what you'll find is restorative justice being a category of justice. And one of the reasons I left it off is because I think it does encompass these other categories, but it's also complicated. It's also complicated. It's complicated in the way that compensatory justice is complicated. And it's complicated because it requires a question of restoration to what? And it requires a consideration of how compounded injustice has produced the current situation. And if you're going to focus on restorative justice, you've got to start to answer the ways in which injustice has been compounded. So the idea of justice, this is actually both a fraught but actually quite fertile area of scholarly discussion in the environmental justice field, and it's all been driven by questions that have been raised by activists. Go to the next slide. The equity and equality. Right? You see these two terms being put in competition, as it were. And the idea is that what equity, the way it's used, is, at least to the extent that I understand it, the way it's used is that equality has, in our legal regime, largely been a formal proposition. And that what equity does is it suggests that there are other things that you have to take into account before you can even get to the question of formal equality. And the idea, you know, for example, you know, in racial discrimination law, right, the formal equality was always the protection that laws could take. And what the courts ultimately did was to look at the effects. And so and look at the intention. And if you look at the effects and the intention, you might say that formal equality is insufficient. But there's a lot of discussion about that, and I'd be happy to address it in the question. So the last slide these are the challenges to the EJ activists, the challenge to governmental actors, and it's a challenge to scholars. That is, the critique of our environmental regime, which was made by the environmental justice community, the activists, raise issues that people in all of these sectors have to take into account. Obviously, the constraints on the kinds of ways in which the issues will be framed, articulated, and made intelligible to the various institutional actors differ. There's going to be more constraints on policymakers than there are on scholars investigating them. Right? Understanding the institutional limitations is also part of our task. So I'll end there and be happy to answer questions. Now, I'd forgotten whether they're going to be curated or whether I should just answer them myself. Or
first of all, thank you so much, Professor Torres, for an incredibly generative and informative discussion that really helps set the table for the questions that, and concerns that are shaping this workshop series and our lab as a whole. So thank you again, and I really appreciate as well our audience and the questions that are already coming in. So I can I guess pose the questions that have come in. I have one myself as well that if we have time I'd love to get to, but let's start here with a question from this is from Catherine McHugh, and she asks, what's your view on compensatory justice given to people or communities by an entity that proposed a destructive project, put those people, that community, through years of mental, emotional anguish, financial burden, loss of one's time, etc. But then the project was ultimately canceled and never built. And she's specifically referring here to an example in Virginia involving the Union Hill community and the proposed Atlantic Coast Pipeline, which you might be aware of, but was ultimately one where it was canceled. But as she alludes to here, that certainly was not the entirety of the story.
Well, I mean, let me see if I understand and maybe the person who asked the question can fill out some of the questions. So if the question is, will the party that proposed the activity, here it's a pipeline, could be a plant, could be anything, right? But will the party that proposed the project underwrite resistance to it? Yeah, I think probably not, and I'm not sure it should. One of the things you want to do is you want to ensure that the permitting process, assuming there is a permitting process, the permitting process takes into account all of the things that the parties who were resisting it raised during the effort to stop it. Now, that is, remember this slide about process failure, right? One of the questions is look, if we have to burden ourselves with additional costs to do things which you should have been able to discover through the permitting process, then that's a failure of government, right? It's a failure of you to do what we've been telling you need to do, so that you take our concerns seriously at the beginning of the process, right? If there are actual damages, then certainly there should be some compensation. But if it's just underwriting the resistance, then I think that's a government issue.
Thank you. So our next question is from our own Jonna Yarrington, who is a research associate within the Repair Lab. And she asks if you might address the possibility of torts in more detail in the frame of compensatory justice that you mentioned. She's wondering what you think about the benefits of framing justice in terms of liability. It seems very available to economic, qualitative measures of damages. What does possible redistribution of damages do for the concept of democracy and equity equality?
So now, did she say courts or torts?
Torts.
Torts. Okay,
Yeah.
Wanted to be sure. Well, I mean, look, let me give you one example, right? You currently have a number of cities that are suing petrochemical manufacturers across the country, right? Because under state tort law, in order to receive compensation for the expenditures cities have had to make in order to protect their citizens. So that in some ways, the tort regime is not a perfect regime. It does give you a framework within our existing law. In some ways, you could consider this private law, right? That there's standards of behavior that you're supposed to conform to. If you violate those standards of behavior and they result in damages, then we can use the tort system to figure it out. The good thing that your questioner pointed out was that the advantage of the tort system is that it does require an articulation of what the damages are, right? And in some ways, it does it's hard to put dollars and cents to every damage, but it does require that, right? And it means that if you've been damaged, you can say, I've had to, because of your actions, I've had to take these expenses, right? And you can document that, and you can also figure out where the cost avoidance ought to lie, right? And so it raises issues that then the government might take into account. The tort system is one of the interesting things about our legal system, right, is that its capacity to flexibly address changed situations. Now, it may be, right, certainly in the context of climate, ultimately, too big to be able to be litigated a piecemeal under the tort system. But like, think of the tobacco litigation, right? In some ways, the tobacco litigation arose largely not just from the harm that the tobacco caused, right, but because the tobacco manufacturers concealed their knowledge of the harm, right? And while it ultimately drove a nationwide settlement, it was the roll up of all of those cases that actually produced the hydraulic pressure, as it were, to get that national settlement. So, can private actors use the tort system to try to generate the kind of pressure that will lead, the people who are on the hook to ask for a comprehensive settlement, which might be national in level, might be statewide in level, we don't know, right? But to ask for some kind of comprehensive settlement, I think the tort system does have those advantages, and it's not like the tort system is a crapshoot. I mean, you can kind of know what the standards are, and you can both sides are apprised in advance, even though the way in which it's being used might be novel. They have to fit within established legal categories, or at least push those categories a little bit. So it's not like anyone's caught off guard.
So I have a big question that I think in some ways gets back to your book, The Miner's Canary, and it's concerning the kind of implications of environmental quality and damage and the efforts to repair that damage for democracy. Our research lab is part of the broader democracy initiative here at UVA. And I'm thinking, especially when you were discussing some of the work looking at tree canopy and air quality and environmental health in urban America, it brings to mind, say, the work of sociologists like Eric Kleinenberg, who have written about the need for social infrastructure, parks, green space, public libraries, sidewalks, the things that sort of help promote a more public and civic oriented culture. These are also environmental issues, and they're also particular issues that have affected communities of color and have had, the effects of which have been maldistributed. So I guess maybe if you could talk a little bit about how you see the implications of the issues at the forefront of environmental justice and climate justice as being connected to the broader threats to democracy itself today.
Well, I'm glad it's a little question. Let me say a couple of things. One is the term social infrastructure is actually really a critical idea, right? Because the investigating the kind of process failure questions that I raised, right, tied, and I'm actually glad you asked this question, they tie directly to critiques of the democratic process, right? And my co-author Lonnie Guinier, she spent her life working on ways to improve democratic accountability. Now, in another piece that she and I wrote, what we argued you have to create what we called constituencies of accountability. So that movement activists have to have constituencies of accountability, but these constituencies of accountability also have to be mobilized to raise the similar issues with the existing political infrastructure. So that let me give you an example. Parks are a great example. So a good friend of mine who passed away a couple of years ago, and his memorial service was just a couple of weeks ago, had this great idea, right? And his great idea was to regreen the LA River. Okay, now that, in some camps that might fall into the category of craziness, right? We're going to regreen the LA River. And one of the reasons he wanted to do it is because LA is remarkably park poor. Of all the major cities, it's probably the most park poor city. And what he also recognized is something that Olmsted recognized, right? That parks and outdoor spaces are where you create community. So that in fact, attention to things like green space, parks, whether they're vest pocket parks or more wild spaces, they're places where community itself is constituted. That's critical for democracy. So regreening the LA River doesn't just mean you've got to mobilize people to get that project underway. It means that at the end of the day, should you succeed, you will have created a new public space. And that public space, in my view, is vital to the health of democracy. I think the health of democracy can in many ways be measured by the way in which people think of social space as being available to them, right? So Yifu Tuan, who's a geographer, is written about all of this stuff in some detail. And, landscapes of fear, right? You want to eliminate that. Right? What the public health people tell us is, it's not just about the kind of social engineering, it's about physical health, right? But I'm telling you that it's not just about physical health, it's about the capacity to build social health. And so, you shouldn't think of parks just as amenities. You shouldn't think of green spaces just as amenities. They are amenities, but in my view, they're part of the fabric through which a community is constituted. And so I think it's actually vital for democratic participation. I'm working with one of the local land trusts here who's actively thinking about that. We spent our entire organizational existence thinking about conserving land. Maybe we ought to think about conserving it to do what for the community, and how do we make it more available to those communities that aren't necessarily near the places where we've been conserving land, because that's going to serve a function too. And suddenly they're thinking about ways to build social networks. Those social networks, they're like the capillaries of democracy. Right? Maybe not the veins and arteries, but they're at least the capillaries.
Yeah, and I think just as a quick follow-up, I was, when you mentioned Los Angeles and it's the lack of park space, I think back to, and this is something I've written a little bit about, is the impact of Prop 13, which was the kind of the seminal moment in the tax revolts of the late 1970s. It really is considered instrumental in the rise of the political right. And one of the effects of Prop 13 at the local level in California was it actually decimated local recreation budgets, actually kind of contributed to the lack of park space that you see in Los Angeles today, which kind of leads to another question I had on my mind is, where do you see some of the real political challenges of this moment toward more justice-oriented environmental policies going forward?
The challenges?
Yeah, perhaps, we might need to schedule another session for that.
Yeah, well, no, I can give you an example. Gray Davis, right? The deposed governor of California, during the rolling blackouts and brownouts that California was enduring, said what we're going to do is we're going to build a new plant, right, to generate more electricity. I kept telling them the problem was in Houston, not in Sacramento. No one believed me. But they said we're going to build a new plant, and guess what? We're going to build it on land the state already owns, and so the cost will be lower. Everybody will be happier. It'll be more energy, and the land the state already owns happens to be an historically Black community. So we're going to take this green space that is this Black community, and we're going to build a power plant, right? And everybody's he's thinking it's a win-win, right? More energy, low cost, and that community resisted it. Because they said, this green space is critical to our well-being. And you can't continue to do what you've done historically, which is to build on the backs of people who are already burdened, right? So the challenge, right? The challenge the challenge of funding things like a green infrastructure, right, is going to be crucial. I think the public health data that's emerging is actually going to be helpful for advocates, just like it was helpful in the restructuring of the cap and trade system in California. So I think the main challenge is to ensure that people understand that environmental justice is not special pleading. That in fact, the environmental justice advocates are the miner's canary, right? That one of the things that Lonnie and I said is that one way to understand race is as a diagnostic, right? So if you look at things that aren't working for Black people, chances are good they're not working for other people as well. That is, I think, where the hope lies, because that also helps you see where your allies are, right? So the challenge is, I think, that globally stated, is not to understand environmental justice as special pleading, but to understand it as integral to environmental planning. I don't know if that helps, but.
Hey. So I'm wondering if you could, and again, for all the folks in the audience, if you have more questions, please post them. We'll be sure to get to them. I just wanted to sort of ask you to say a little bit more, again, as a new research lab here at UVA focused on promoting and generating interdisciplinary research on race and environmental justice, and as someone who has started a center at Yale focused as well on environmental justice. I'm wondering what your thoughts are at this point in the movement and as well in the field of environmental justice, where we as scholars and the academy as a whole should be headed, and where do you sort of see some of the most promising directions?
Well, a couple of things. One of the things that the center that I'm starting, one of the things we focus on is partnerships with environmental justice communities, organizations, to make sure we listen to what they say. The second thing is to reach out to my colleagues across the campus who are involved in excuse me, environmental research, and get them to ask the question, what's the justice component of the outcomes of this research? So what that's yielded, excuse me, is connections with people in architecture, connection with people in urban planning, connection with people in public health, connection with people in the med school, connection with people who are actually doing biomimicry, right? Research in biomimicry for carbon capture. And just getting them to think about the social implications, or to get them to think about, as you solve the technical problems that you're investigating or researching, if there is an application of your research to the world, which we all hope there will be, right? What are the justice implications of that application, right? So that as they give things to the world, right, they're thinking about the social impact of that as well. So that's what we're trying to do. And I'm just trying to get people to talk to each other early on, so they can start to think about the ideas of justice in their work. So that's what I'm trying to do. Anyway.
Wonderful. So we have another question. This is again from Jonna Yarrington. She asks, she wonders whether activism is, like torts, tied to post hoc damages, in the sense that communities won't necessarily self-identify as affected, harmed, until after the fact. How can communities self-identify before they are threatened or damaged? And how do you think activists can be engaged?
Right. Well, she's obviously right. you don't ask somebody to get off your foot till they're standing on it, right? So, so that's right. One of the things, and I think one of the ways that both the Green New Deal, the Build Back Better, the Justice 40, all of those, the programs that have been proposed, create an opportunity for communities to be involved earlier in the stage. Now, a lot of these communities are going to be already self-identified, okay, either from past struggles or from just the cohesiveness of the community that already exists. So the only way to really answer that question is to say, how can these communities take their political capital, right, and invest it in improving the process of decision making, where the decisions are going to have environmental impact, so that they may have come to recognize their sense of connectedness through the resistance to environmental harms, but that doesn't define their total capacity. And what their capacity is to take what they've learned from addressing the harms and asking, how can we use that to improve democratic decision making? It may even be, right, that these groups, right, can come up with other solutions. So you mentioned, for instance, sidewalks. I was going to mention that earlier, because when you talk to the group, they say, look, one of the things that makes this neighborhood unsafe is we've got to walk in traffic. I don't have a safe way to get my kids to school, right? The other thing is, this is another example, right? The buses don't go where we need them to go. So what we've already started to talk to one DOT about revising the way in which they evaluate their the metrics they use to evaluate their transportation system. So the most common method is number of trips on time. Okay, so that's great. You want your buses to run on time. We said, well, there's actually a question you have to ask before that. Right? Where are the buses leaving from, or are they capturing the population that needs buses? And are they going where people need to go? How many transfers do you need to take to get to where they're going? So in LA, I hate to keep referring to LA, but one of the issues that arose there is you couldn't get to a hospital without making a number of transfers. And so one easy solution, right, is to make the hospitals the transfer point. Right, so people need to go to hospitals, they can take the bus if necessary. The other thing is, how are rural communities served by public transportation? These are the hardest communities to serve, but in fact, some of those are the ones that might need it the most. Let's start to put that into our calculus of how we evaluate, what metrics we use to assess say the public transportation system. So all of those kinds of issues, which you don't think of necessarily as environmental justice issues, but if you listen to the communities, suddenly, okay, this is what's on their mind. We have to take this into account. These are the things that produce the stressors in their lives that result in, increased morbidity and mortality. And, it may be that it's, where's the researcher that we're going to find that's going to do that? Well, maybe a couple places. Maybe, the people who are doing energy research on electrifying bus fleets, right? And maybe the cost profile of the transition from diesel to electric, and whether that increases your capacity to add routes, right? What counts as a successful route, for example? And here we're just talking about buses, but you can go through any institution in our civic life and ask these questions.
Mm-hmm. So we have a question here from Natalie Gonzalez, and she asks if you could expand a little bit more on the question of how green spaces and really rethinking space is vital to democracy.
Well, yeah, no, here I would refer you to, Andrea, I'm sure you have, given your research, I'm sure you can refer to better sources. But I'd first turn back to Olmsted, right? And I know he's come into some criticism recently, not the least of which for trying to engineer wetlands out of Central Park. But to think about what are the purposes for which you are creating a park, right? And just to kind of go through them. One of the things that you want to think about is whether this green space, right, is a place that people in the community feel safe being in. That is it a public space that people feel safe in? It's one. You can also do things like community gardens. So community gardens then serve a couple of two, maybe three, many purposes. One is they're a place where people can actually produce food to eat. It's one. They're a place where people can learn about the processes of food production. That's two. And they're a green space that makes use of, as has happened in Detroit, of vacant spaces in the city, right? So rather than that vacant space being a blight, right, it's a place where the community can come together. So to me, the capacity to be able to meet your neighbor in a place that feels safe and actually begin to appreciate that you and your neighbor have something in common besides addresses, right, is critical to building the kind of trust that, I feel like Pollyanna right now, building the kind of trust that democracy really needs to function. I mean, I think one of we're not all rent seekers. I know that people will disagree with that idea, right? And we can't conceive of each person as being a rent seeker, right? In order to find out what we might have in common to make the community we live in the community we want to be in. I think that's the key thing. So let's take the LA River again, right? So there's, as I said, there's at least two parts of it. One is the organizing to build the plan, right? And to get people to conceive of it as it's not a complete harebrained plan, right? One. The second part is, as you actually create those green spaces, you bring people to a place that they hadn't been before, and they discover one another, right? That's the way in which community gets created. Bob Moses, who recently passed away, right, was asked, how do you organize? And he says, you take a ball. I said, what? Yeah, you take a ball and you start bouncing it. Then someone comes up and they want you to pass the ball to them. And pretty soon you have a game, right? And out of that game, you build a community. This is a guy, right, who's at the forefront of the civil rights struggle, right? His answer is you bring a ball.
That is a real important reminder here of the work of organizing and the work we all have ahead. And so again, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And I cannot think of a more better way for us to begin the work of this workshop and our lab. And we really appreciate you taking the time to join us this afternoon. So I guess we'll all give a virtual applause and thank you again. And we are really enjoyed this afternoon and
thank you.
Talk more. All right.
Okay.
Take care. Thanks everyone for joining us.